All right, welcome to the Unfazed, Unedited podcast, where we provide commentary on complicated topics in an uncomplicated format. I'm Dr. Shaunna Payne Gold, and I go by she, her, hers pronouns. And Dr. Lisa, it is going to be hard not to slip down the slope of all things election, given that it is actually election day. But we've got some other things to get to before all the ballots are counted, right?
Yes, we have. So this is your reminder, oh listener, if you happen to be listening in the morning and there's still hours left in the
Please.
day, please get out and vote. If that is still something on your to-do list, and remember those lines can get long as you approach the deadline, whatever time that is in your state. So if you can get there earlier, and
Hmm.
get your civic duty on.
There you go. That's it. That's it. I know here in Prince George's County, Maryland, election day goes from 7 a.m. to 8 p.m. So make it your business to be there. And Lisa, I have to tell you, I remember this is the one and only time I've ever done this, but I remember going to vote for then Senator Obama and people, including myself, bringing out the lawn chairs, the snacks,
Hmm.
the
Hmm.
coolers, I think I got there at probably 5:30-ish, and I was easily, what, 50th in line, maybe, in the dark, in the cold, in all of that. Fortunately, the lines went quickly, but yeah, people were there for the long haul for sure. So I have already mailed in my ballot, so I did not have to experience that this time, but
Hmm.
whatever it takes. I will bring snacks, Lisa. I will bring snacks, lawn
Well,
chairs, coats,
yeah.
scarves. Yeah.
Although, little caveat to that is some states have made illegal the providing of snacks and beverages to people who are waiting in line to vote. So you're not allowed to give refreshments to people. So if you think you're going
Hmm.
to be standing in line and you are in one of those states, bring your own snacks
Bring
with
your
you
own.
and
Bring
do
your
not give
own.
those to other people.
There you
Yeah.
go. There you go.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Yes, I remember. I mean, people were ready. I was like, whoa. So, given that, let's dive into the business of the day, which is our word of the week. Invisible labor. Now, Lisa, I have to say, I've been aware of this term for a long time, but I did not know that this was coined back in the 80s, 1980s. And so the term is invisible labor, which is a philosophical, sociological, and economic concept, bringing all those different areas of study together that applies to the work that's unseen, unvalued, or undervalued, and often discounted as not important despite its essential role in supporting workplaces, families, teams, organizations, anywhere that you might find a group of folks. And so, given that, Lisa, in my household, I call this the magic fairy. The magic fairy is the person that, when you drop the food on the floor and you choose not to pick it up, apparently everybody in my house that's under the age of 46 thinks that the magic fairy will show up and sweep that up, clean it up, wipe it up, pick it up. I know that's a very small micro example of invisible labor, but when you think about it, Lisa, it's rampant. It's everywhere. It's going back to an article that I read many years ago talking about heterosexual relationships and parenting, entitled uh, Dad is Clueless and Mom is Worn Out, something to that effect. Basically saying that there are groups of people, because of their identities and privilege, that get a little cozy in being completely unaware of the work that others are really stressed about. And so, an example of this that I saw in a meme on Instagram the other night was the couple, they were laying in bed, falling asleep. The mom was thinking about everything, what's for breakfast tomorrow? What's for lunch? What's for dinner? Where do we have to be? We've got 17 different appointments. Oh, and by the way, I have to go to work, da da da. And the man that was laying on the other side of the bed was thinking something quite lewd, like, is she going to care if I grab her, whatever, tonight so I can sleep better? Like, that was the difference in thought pattern behind the labor that's carried versus the oblivious positioning of any individual that usually is not seen to carry the labor. So, Lisa, I think, given what, 30 something years later, and we're still talking about this concept readily, it's got to be pretty profound for a lot of people. And I think those folks may have known what the word was, or known what the feeling was, but may not be
Yeah.
acquainted.
I think that's right. I think that there's a whole generation of women in particular that felt it, right? Like I'm
Mhm.
basically either working a full-time job from home and getting no compensation or indeed thank yous for it, or I'm working a part-time or a full-time job and also then doing an additional full-time job of all of those home-related activities, right? And childcare and grocery shopping and cooking and clean, blah, 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 and not getting paid for
Mhm.
it or getting a thank you for it. And I imagine that
Mhm.
that feeling is quite memorable.
Oh, for sure. Oh, for sure. So, yeah, so it's something that we should continue to think about. And, it's one thing that we talk about, Lisa, in some of our trainings where we need to develop our noticing muscle, meaning that for those of you who may benefit from invisible labor, start to notice what happens and why it happens and who's doing it when you know it's not you, right? So that's why it
Right,
makes me
right.
laugh, like, the fun TikToks and posts around oftentimes women being very frustrated because someone did not put toilet paper back on the roll. Like, that's a micro example of using your noticing muscle because someone has to do it. How long are you willing to go without doing it because you didn't notice? So, yeah, I think it's a whole concept that I have lived a lot over the last, 13 years.
Oh, I
Um,
bet, I bet.
and I would suggest that, we just need to continue to build that noticing muscle so we pay attention to
Hmm.
why it's done, how it's done, and who doesn't get credit for it, right?
Yep, 100%.
So there we have it. But all right, well, given that, Lisa, let's dive into phase one. Phase one. And so, Lisa, I know that you and I both have been paying attention
Hmm.
to the companies that are now returning to work
Yeah.
post-pandemic after declaring that they would not or could not or should not, oftentimes with a new CEO that comes in that decides this reversal. But in particular, a couple of case studies that we could probably bring up here. Dell, for example, uh, decided to institute their return to work policy only 2 days notice to return back to work in mid-October. Yeah, as a parent, that to me is
Hmm.
so
Yeah.
oblivious to reality.
Yeah. Yeah.
Regardless of socioeconomic status, so oblivious to childcare. And then Amazon CEO said that if you don't like the 5 day a week in the office policy, then you can just leave. How about that? Pack up your
Hmm.
grip and goodbye. And so they have a new 5 days a week policy that's a mandate for them. And so, Lisa, this is ridiculous because we've seen this pile on and on. Uh, JD Vance didn't help when he said something to the effect of, just call your family and get some help from them. And, that's that moment where you're just beating your head up against the wall saying, yeah, you're
Okay.
ridiculous, as if no one would have thought of that.
Right,
Like,
exactly. There was this really funny video on the socials where this guy was like, goes to the graveyard and he's like kneeling in front of his parents' graves. And he's like, so I hear now that you need to take over childcare because, that's what I
no.
need to do. And I'm just wondering how that's going to work, right? Because, my partner and I are at work from like 8 to 5. And so we're going to need some help around these hours. So
Mhm.
how might that work? And he's talking to,
Yeah.
essentially the graves. And it was so perfect because,
Oh, yeah, for
like,
sure. For
I
sure.
mean, yeah, so clueless of a statement. But I remember
Yes.
seeing that and thinking that that was just the funniest thing around. Okay, so what about all these people who don't have family, who, for whatever reason, right? Or they don't live in the same state as family? Like, it's just stupid. Yeah.
Oh, yeah. When I heard that, I'm thinking to myself, what if folks like me are quite a far distance from family, number one. Number two, that's the assumption that your family member is able to take care of a child of any sort. The assumption that that family member is responsible enough or adept enough to keep your child in ways that you trust, right? Because we talked about before in a previous podcast that there are some estranged relationships with family members
Yeah.
sometimes.
Yeah.
And so that kicks in. You might have, family members that are around the corner from your house, and you'd be like, no, I don't trust them any further than I can throw them. So no, thank you. So, with this, I think what's interesting is that we know that childcare is indeed a crisis in this country if you do not fit into that very small slice of whatever has been considered a traditional family with values that really only held probably 50 years ago, to be honest with you, Lisa. And so, given that, not even talking about the overlay of other identities that preclude one from being able to access safe, clean, healthy childcare, I think again, it ends up being this situation where we're calling on micro level solutions to a macro level problem. Like, Lisa, you're not a good parent if you don't do this, this, and this. When Lisa's
Right.
like,
Right.
when did I become responsible for an entire system that doesn't meet anybody's needs? Like,
Yeah.
really?
Yeah.
And so, with that, I think we need to really pay attention to this. And for those that may not have childcare responsibilities, but you have friends,
Mm-hmm.
loved ones where you can chip in where you can, I would ask you to do that as a micro approach. I would never say that that's a solution because that's not
No.
your responsibility. And so, given that, Lisa, I know all of this is pouring from my parenting experience, but
Mm-hmm.
from your systemic brain and being an empathetic and a person that has a very strong noticing muscle, what do you say about all this?
What do I say? Well, yeah, it's policy, right? It's bad policy. And I think these companies that are, well, we've talked before about requiring people to come back in the office and how that in and of itself, outside of the child issue, is a problematic frame, right? But then for these companies to make these mandates and provide, in the case of Dell, no notice, and be, like you said, oblivious to the kind of ripple consequence of that for their employees and childcare, um, is just a bad policy, right? Um, and I think that the fundamental issue here is that the United States does a really, really crappy job of providing appropriate childcare for folks, right? And so you've got, well, it doesn't provide childcare, right? Like, isn't that's the problem, right? And then like the standards to establish childcare businesses are different in every state, and in some cases those standards are almost non-existent, right? And then the cost wasn't there. I think you sent me a piece from Chief, that is a kind of an organization for women leaders, that talked about families in the United States are spending nearly 25% of their income on childcare alone. I'm not sure how
Easily.
that, yeah, I don't know how that correlates with other countries, but my guess is it's much higher, just based on what we know about how childcare is talked about here. And then the other piece that's important that you also sent me was about this new report that came out from this consulting company, KPMG. And I'll just read a quote here. The childcare crisis has resulted in a sizable part of the workforce that is either working part-time or missing work entirely due to childcare problems. This has become a structural feature of the US economy and society. So these are people that are missing work only because of childcare problems, right? Nothing else. It is just childcare. And so it's a structural problem that the US refuses to address in any kind of practical policy way. So it makes me mad. It just makes me mad when I think about the number of
Mm-hmm.
women in particular, it's not universal to
Mm-hmm.
women, I realize that, but have said to me that
Mm-hmm.
they're dropping to part-time or they're quitting their job because they earn less
Mm-hmm.
than what it would
Yeah.
cost to pay out in childcare. So they're in a deficit. So they,
Mm-hmm.
well, I'm just not going to work and I'm going to raise my child, right? And I totally get that calculus.
Oh yeah,
Um,
absolutely. Absolutely. I mean that's the math of it. I remember when, obviously when I found out I was pregnant with Trey, I knew how long the wait list could be for childcare specifically. And at the time I was working at the university, which did have a childcare center on its campus. That would have been extremely convenient for me in my work life, but and this is not even talking about the price tag alone. The wait list, I put myself on the wait list when I was 2 months pregnant, which was very early, but not in the childcare world, just early from the pregnancy. Put myself on when I was 2 months pregnant. Don't you know they didn't even call me back until Trey was 2.5 years old, and we had already found other options.
wow. Wow.
So that's number one. And then number two, when I think about this childcare piece, um, you know, how things would have been very different for my family because twins run on both sides of our family. And so our prayer was, please don't let this be because if this is twins and we have two in daycare at the same time, then actually dad would have been quitting his job because we made financially the same amount of money, but because I worked for a state university, I carried all the health benefits. And so by virtue of that math, he would have stayed home, which of course nobody was thinking then because people would say, oh, are you planning to go back to work? And like, actually, if it's twins, he's going to go home. I'm going to work because that was literally the way insurance was set up. But, and again, that was very privileged because a lot of people don't necessarily have federal or state benefits like that that are very sturdy, better than private sector at the time. And so, given that it's a structural issue, with Kendrick's birth, we were still kind of in a lurch for a couple of months, except for a set of twins. One of the twins unfortunately did not make it, which created a space for Kendrick at the daycare where Trey was so that they could be at the both of them at one daycare instead of two different daycares. And so, given that, I have not seen it work. Let's put it that way. I have not seen it work.
Mm-hmm.
And for people that do not have children, obviously, I'm not expecting you to be aware of how much it costs, but just know that in my household, when we had both boys in daycare, it was actually more than our mortgage on a house in Prince George's County that was a 5-bedroom home on a quarter acre of land.
Yeah, that's ridiculous.
Yeah. So we called it our three mortgages. We had our real home mortgage, our daycare mortgage, and our combined school loan mortgage.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it's just so broken. And so for these companies to
Mhm.
mandate the hybrid or work from home schedule created a little bit of wiggle room and reprieve. It certainly didn't solve the problem for everyone, but to take
Mhm.
that away and be so clueless is, just it shows. Although, I mean, I'm stopping mid-sentence there because I'm also thinking, well, I don't think it's the responsibility of private business to provide childcare, right? Like, I don't agree with their policy and the kind of ripple effects and how this is harming families, but I think it's the federal government's or the state government's responsibility to provide appropriate or low-cost childcare for people, right? So it's
Mhm.
also all these pieces that come out in the news that say bad Dell, bad Amazon. Um,
Mhm. Mhm.
I mean, I don't necessarily disagree with that sentiment, but it also skips over and puts the
Mhm.
responsibility on those companies for not doing a better job to support families, and they should. But it also then what have we ignored there? We have ignored the responsibility, in my opinion,
Mhm.
of this kind of how do we better provide for families because we're going to make you give birth.
Mhm.
That's let's not go there because that's going to be a whole
Another
other 10-minute
podcast.
conversation. Yeah,
That's
yeah, yeah.
right.
So
That's right. That's
anyway,
right. Yep,
anywho,
that's
so
right.
maybe that's enough said on this issue.
Uh-huh. Uh-huh. Absolutely. Absolutely. So, and then let me just give you one math piece that in the report from Forbes, it says that their index found that losing just 1 hour of work each week due to a gap in childcare results in an annual loss of between $780 and $1,500. And let me just tell you, if you have a child that's pre-K, 1,500 barely covers the month of daycare. So just want to put some numbers in perspective for people that don't have to think about childcare currently, right? So, well, Lisa, let's dovetail into phase two, which is related but still different when it comes to this topic, is again the Surgeon General, Dr. Vivek Murthy, if I'm pronouncing that correctly, reports that parents are under extreme amounts of stress as a result of intensive parenting. Okay. And with that, I think what's interesting, the quote says, parents and caregivers today face tremendous pressures from familiar stressors, such as worrying about their kids' health and safety and financial concerns, to new challenges like navigating technology, social media, a youth mental health crisis, an epidemic of loneliness that has hit young people the hardest. So he goes on to say, with this advisory, I'm calling for a fundamental shift in how we value and prioritize the mental health and well-being of parents. I'm also outlining policies, programs, and individual actions we all can take to support parents and caregivers. Lisa, I have to say, in the pettiest voice I can muster up, I really don't give a shit about the individual actions that we can all take to support parents and caregivers. We've kind of flirted with that previously. I'm more interested in the policies and programs that get more at the systemic piece of this puzzle.
Right, right.
Because I feel like I feel like we're if we're just looking at the individual actions, then we're just taking a really nasty pie and slicing it up and spreading it out to more people, rather than getting rid of the pie and replacing it with a pie that tastes better for everybody. I'm more looking at systemic stuff because I feel very confident, especially as someone who's been a parent now for 13 years. I have tried a little bit of everything. And I'm talking about a little bit of everything based on my means and socioeconomic status. And that's not too shabby, and it still doesn't work. So I'm thinking about folks that don't have as many resources, and what this means in regards to the expectations for parenting versus what's truly possible for parenting. And there are just way too many things that aren't possible, but the pressure is strong to make it possible. So with that, kudos to the Surgeon General, yet at the same time, I wish this was a bit more forceful. And I also realized that with an election coming up, you almost kind of have to wait like a sitting duck for whoever's coming in to really
Right.
tackle the systemic problems of it. So,
Yeah, and I listened to the Daily that had a discussion about this report and this concept of intensive parenting. And the interviewer is definitely white. And I think the person being interviewed, the journalist, was also white, but I'm not 100% sure about that. But I did wonder around how this concept of intensive parenting, like, to explain what we mean there, it's this always being available for your child, like sitting with your child and watching TV, but while you're watching TV, like explaining to them what's happening or helping them with their homework, or if you're cooking, talking about a scientific something that is related to the cooking, right? Like you're always on, always educating. They're going to like 6 different sports and you're rolling around town, which obviously you, Shaunna, know very, very intimately. And so there's just never any opportunity or any time. And of course, this connects back to phase one with if you don't have good childcare or can't afford childcare, then you never get any time off, right? And I do wonder the degree to which that framing is pulling from whiteness, right? Like it's not, I think parents of all racial identities intensely parent, right? But I'm feeling like there is a differentiation around what that could look like for parents of color, for lesbian and gay parents, right? Like or people who low income parents, right? And I don't know, I haven't read the report from beginning to end, so I don't know if that is addressed. But just kind of from this discussion on the Daily and then kind of reading like some snippets of the report. I'm not sure if it is doing a good job there. And I don't know if you have any thoughts on that, Shaunna.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think intensive parenting obviously is going to look very, very different based on identity groups, right? So, for example, again, and I may be stereotyping, so please, y'all rein me in if you feel that way, that's fine too. But I'm imagining that, for example, if I am a white parent, then intensive parenting would be what you described in regards to sole focus on that child or children as far as what you're doing versus a Black family that is talking, yes, doing that, but then add an additional layer of just flat out safety in any and all situations. I'm imagining LGBT parents dealing quite a bit with bullying from a different angle because they're same-sex parents and they're probably very open and not closeted. And so I'm just thinking about all the different angles from which one would come that, yes, intensive parenting is going to look different. And going back to kind of a little bit of phase one, how much of that intensive parenting is simply a response to the systems that are broken and don't work for our kids. So, for example, when I
Right,
was a
right.
kid, I literally could see my grandmother's house from the school. I mean, it was literally across the street. But, then we were able to walk home or walk to a family member's house after school. And there wasn't really a huge thought about safety or any of that. Um, or let's say, for example, food, something as simple and obviously important as food to every kid. Well, thinking about what if there's an accidental cross contamination and your kid has a food allergy? These are things that I'm not saying they weren't happening then. I'm just saying that when everything is urgent and everything is a priority, then when does one ever get a break or at least some relief to make the system more manageable because the system is requiring this of you, right? So, we had a wonderful conversation on this, Lisa, when we were at the airport, just to remind people that the question was at what time would be best to have dinner for the boys. Well, interesting, right? Because one of my boys, the most athletic one, gets out of school at 2:30, has football practice from 6 to 8. My other kid gets out at 4, and he usually goes with us, or he may have some other homework or something else to do afterwards. So what kid, or even just what human being in general, should really, from a healthy perspective, have lunch around 11:30 or 12, but not see dinner until 8:30 or 9? Doesn't quite make a lot of sense, right? But the systems that we have, including school, after school activities, extracurricular, and work, would make it seem like that's your only choice. And so given that that requires parents like me to then become these intensive parents where, okay, let's see, can I find Uber Eats somewhere nearby? Can Trey stop at this store to go pick up something on the way back? Like all of this invisible labor to make us think about how everybody can get what they need at the time they need it when none of the times work for anyone or everyone. It is just mass confusion. And
Mm-hmm.
it's not for
Mm-hmm.
lack of attention or effort of parents.
Right, right. And how do we respond to that from a policy perspective, but
Mm-hmm.
understanding that the definition of intense is different based on your social identities, right? So, you know,
Absolutely.
if you barely earn any money and you're working two jobs, that's going to also contribute to, well, your capacity to parent intensely because you may not have the time to, right? Um, but then how do you even support your child who wants to participate in all of these sporting activities, which is good for their social development, their emotional learning, right? But you are working two jobs and also don't have the money or time to send them to these sport. Like that is a stress that I don't know if this report accounts for. And it's not an individual, it's not like having your neighbor take your child to sports, right? That's an individual response, but that's not what's needed, right? Like the minimum wage needs to be higher, there needs to be greater tax credits for parents, like all these other things that need to then create the opportunity that this parent doesn't have to work two jobs and has the financial capacity and time to be able to have their child engage in these activities that will help their social emotional learning. So yeah.
Yeah, and the ugly piece of the puzzle is for all of those folks that either may not be parents or they just may not connect to what we're mentioning here around this intensive parenting. The option can't always be, oh, well, I guess your kid doesn't get to do it. Oh, well, I
Mm-hmm.
guess your kid doesn't get to do XYZ. That can't always be the option for the same identity groups every time, right? So, with that, I think there's something to be said about, again, how nonchalant and flippant we can be around your choice
Mm-hmm.
or your
Mm-hmm.
ability to provide, because again, we're perceiving this as the system is flawed, so young people then have to suffer because the system is flawed.
Right.
Meanwhile, we are like, what's the name of that cartoon? It's the is it The Incredibles? Where the mom is like Elastigirl, where
Yeah, 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 yeah.
that's what this is reminding me of, is that it only works if one person in the family is Elastigirl, stretching and snapping to get people where they need to be with what they need to have when they need to be there. If not, hey, they just don't get to do it. And I'm like, that doesn't sit well with me.
And then you have a very, very stressed out parent that might have mental health needs that are unmet because of that stress, right? And that is presumably what this, Dr. Vivek Murthy is looking to address, because that's been overlooked, but it's
Mhm,
differentiated, right? So it's a pretty horrible cycle, as I'm like,
mhm,
as we're talking about this and I'm kind of thinking about it, I'm like, oh,
mhm.
great.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Well, and then so the pat answer that I will always fume over as I hear it is, of course, the flippant person that also says, "Oh, well, if you didn't, you should have thought about that before you had kids."
Oh, right, right. Yeah, no.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, no, that's not how that works. That's not how that works. And I applaud people. Let's be clear. I am not one of those people that ostracizes or damns people that intentionally choose not to have children. That is not what I'm saying here. What I'm saying is that trying to give hindsight retrospective to parenting is not helpful, especially by
Right.
non-parents who may not fully understand the systems.
Yeah, and this is a discussion for another phase, but it's been on my mind about how we as a culture so readily blame the people who are harmed by broken systems for the stress or damage that is resulting from those broken
Mhm.
systems, right?
Oh,
Um,
yes.
and
Oh,
so
yes.
it's your fault for having a kid, not that our whole structure, our whole parenting, family, childcare structure creates the conditions where parents are like pulling their hair out, stressed out because they don't have the resources and support they need. Yeah.
Mhm.
But
Absolutely.
anyway,
Absolutely.
anywho.
Yep. Yep. Because we're gonna, research parenting and childcare and everything before we lay down and have a kid. Okay. All right. That
Yeah.
makes complete sense. Fine.
Yeah.
All right, Lisa, take us into phase 3.
Okay, so this is a little bit of a left-hand turn, but I wanted to talk about it because I thought it was great. So I saw this clip on PBS where they were showcasing this exhibit, this art exhibit that's happening at the Museum of Contemporary Art of San Diego. It's open until February if you live in the area, but it is called For Dear Life: Art, Medicine, and Disability. And it is the first exhibition to survey the themes of illness and disability in American art from the mid 20th century to the COVID pandemic. So there's never been a focus on the intersection of art and disability or illness. And so this exhibition is showcasing that issue, but also all of the artists that are having their work displayed have been disabled or ill in some way or currently are. Like that's how they identify. Um, and so, according to the CDC, 1 in 4 adults are living with some kind of disability, right? So it's 25% of people. And yet, how infrequently do we as a community, as a broader culture, really think about and talk about what it means to live in a world that is not designed for folks who have a disability, right? And so the curator was interviewed on this PBS piece, and she was saying that it's about holding on, right? So the title of the show, For Dear Life, right? And you often hear about I'm holding on for dear life. So she's talking about that it's this conjuring up this idea of holding on to something, whether that's holding on to your seat, holding on to an assistive device, holding on to someone else, and thinking about the idea that in the holding on, that's when life becomes dear. And I just thought that was a really interesting way to frame it. So anyway, there's all these decades of artists that are being represented. And one stuck out to me that I just wanted to bring up here and then get your response, Shaunna, is there was one artist called Alison O'Daniel. She identifies as hard of hearing. She wears or uses hearing aids. And she was talking about what does it mean to lose sound and how do you cope with that? How do you compensate for the loss of sound? But then also, like, who owns sound? Right, which I thought was such an interesting perspective. And she did this piece related to, it's a movie, I think, a documentary, which was played, on loop in the exhibit. And it's about this. I guess 12 California high schools had all of their tubas stolen, and so she was looking into how the loss of those instruments and that particular instrument, because that's a very like deep and powerful sound, right, that instrument makes. So she was looking into the feeling around how did the instructors and the students manage with that loss of sound, and she titled it like the theft of sound. And so she was kind of making the connection to that, and then folks who are deaf or hard of hearing, whether they have been so from birth or whether that loss of sound has evolved over time. And so I just thought that was really interesting to hear her interviewed. But generally, what are your thoughts on this in terms of this exhibit being in 2024 the first of its kind, at the very least, right?
Yeah. No, I think it's powerful. I think part of me really loves this from, of course, the intersectional piece of things in regards to identity and art. Also, too, as someone who thought I was going to do music my entire life, the theft of sound is very interesting because I'm even thinking about whether it was band or orchestra or drum corps that I'd been in high school, middle school, high school, college around. Yeah, I started thinking immediately, what would I do if there was a theft of sound? Like, what would our band or our orchestra do if we did not have the fundamental instrument of tuba, which is almost like the pouring the concrete foundation of your house to all other sound. Like it's easier to hear other octaves of sound when you have deeper foundations of sound. So like, for example, it doesn't sound like it goes together, but tuba and flute and piccolo go together nicely. Why? Because they're different octaves of range. It's easier to hear the flute when you have more tuba. You forget the tuba is there, but the flute gets to be in the forefront. And so, I think the theft of sound, but then what does the replacement or not of sound feel like? And does it need to be replaced? Right. So, like, if I were a band conductor or orchestra conductor, I know I feel like I'm going on a tangent, but I'm coming back. If I were a band or orchestra conductor and all of my tubas were stolen, then I would pull in other instruments that have similar sound, like baritone, like trombone, like very deep French horns or deep woodwinds. And so given that, I think what's interesting is the ownership of it depending on who owns it, determines who gets to replace it, which then has me thinking about who owns a lot of things, assistive technology, meaning who can afford it or not, who owns I'm thinking about some of the movies I've seen where it has talked about there's somebody who doesn't even need the solution that has it, owns it, has the privilege of access to it. It's just a matter of whether they're willing to share it, right? And so for me, I think this is I mean, I wish it was closer to the East Coast because I would be there in a millisecond because it really forces you to think outside of yourself. And especially as I see my grandmother age and my parents age, life is certainly fragile. And at the same time, disability can also be a visitor. And it's just a matter of when disability may show up for you, when it may have been a lifelong experience for other people. I have a good friend of mine who I first met doing when he did Ironman Maryland, and I met him and his guide. And Lisa, he was out there near you recently, where he is deaf, but also losing or in the process of losing his vision and is now going to school to learn how to accommodate oneself, right? So things like, the kitchen, we talked about this before with food and having things that are already prepared that you can just take out of a bag or what have you. And so, I wish more people could use the medium of art to think about what may not often touch their lives, but will certainly be a visitor at some point. So this is pretty
Yeah.
powerful. I cannot wait to take a look at the PBS on this because it's powerful. Um, and we
Hmm.
just take for granted that it's not going to visit us at some
Yeah,
point.
and I think there's so much cultural stigma associated with disability, and so
Yes,
many people
yes.
with disabilities live in the shadows or are invisible to able-bodied people, right? And obviously there was the disability rights movement at a similar kind of time frame as the civil rights movement. Um, but the curator said that what this exhibition does is it allows the artists to reframe disability as a space of creativity, generativity, improvisation, and ingenuity. And I thought that was great too, because I think we able bodied people pigeonhole and constrict folks with disabilities as um, no longer having the same value, right,
That's right.
in
That's right.
society. And so even things like, a
Mm-hmm.
person is quote unquote bedridden or confined to a wheelchair, like even the
Mm-hmm.
language is restrictive. Whereas
That's
what
right.
she's saying with this art exhibition is it's a way to think about and envision disability and illness and medicine broadly, right, in a way that is creative
Mhm.
and in opposition to that constricting invisibility that happens that we
Mhm.
continually do. So I don't know, I kind of wish I lived in San Diego, but
That's right.
to go to it, I mean, maybe I'll take a trip there. But yeah, and the thing that really bothered me, Shaunna, is that it's the first of its kind. Like that in and
Yes.
of itself tells us how
Yes.
little we as a culture elevate and engage with the issue of disability and illness and what that means, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and it was ironic that you even brought this up, Lisa, because I recently saw a clip of a African American gentleman that is on the autism spectrum that he does drawings of cityscapes all over the country. And so they showed a video of him in a helicopter flying over Manhattan, looking at the city. And then a few hours later, he is just in a room on his own, no real windows or canvas, no real windows to look out at, and just the canvas and easel. And he draws the entire cityscape from his mind. And so, with that, I don't want it to seem as if it's um, uh, what have we called it before? Disability porn.
Inspiration.
Thank
Yeah,
you.
inspiration porn.
Inspiration
Yeah.
porn. Thank you. I don't want it to be inspiration porn, but what I am saying is, what if, again, going back to neurodiversity, what if the wiring that we as folks who are neurotypical assume that it's restrictive when it's actually
Right.
freeing and creative and broadening in ways that many other artists couldn't even imagine sharing their gift with the world. So, with that,
Hmm.
I'm the one that can't draw a stick figure, obviously, and at the same time would applaud anyone who has any creative bones in their body, because I certainly do not. But again, it's defiant. To your point, it's
Yeah.
what's taken it so long, and it's defiant, which I
Yeah.
really love about it. So,
Yeah.
oh, I'm gonna have to go watch this for sure.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. All right. Well, let's end
Uh,
on that defiant note on election day.
that's right.
Um,
On election
yeah.
day.
Yeah. So get out your defiant vote.
Mhm. That's
Um,
right. That's right.
and
Exactly.
we Shaunna and I will be recording a bonus episode tomorrow,
Yes.
the day after, I guess. Um, and we'll be
We
dropping that
hope.
at some time later on in the day, as we
Yeah.
learn what the outcome of this election is. So please do watch for that. But I think that
Yeah.
is a wrap for this week. Where can folks
Yes.
find us?
Absolutely. So we're going to keep the mics out from now until the post-election episode. So until then, you can find us on YouTube at Unfazed Unedited. You can find us at Apple Podcast and Spotify, if that's your thing. We're on Instagram at Unfazed Pod, LinkedIn at Unfazed Pod, or you can email us at info@unfazedpodcast.com. And of course, we have our website with all the things, unfazedpodcast.com, where you can access both the old and the new shows. So, of course, if you liked this week's episode, please continue to like, subscribe, leave a review, share this with your friends, coworkers, or other folks in this phase of your election cycle, right, Lisa?
Yes, yes. Vote, vote, vote.
Vote, vote. All right, we'll talk to you soon.
Bye.